Hi, everyone. This week we're talking about facilitating creative processes. You've put a lot of work into working with your organizations to understand the current situation, to diagnose what's going on, what is. Now, the next phase of that is to, turn to creative thinking processes to, make sure your diagnosis is correct and to start to come up with creative solutions and strategic opportunities to the challenges that are facing your organizations. So one of the readings we have for this week has a nice definition of creative thinking. It's how people approach problems and solutions, their capacity to put existing ideas together in new combinations. Um, I think it's valuable as a leader, as you're developing your leadership skills, to have strong creative thinking and critical thinking skills. But I honestly think one of the maybe more important skills for a leader is to be able to guide others through creative processes, to lead meetings, to facilitate creative thinking. And so that's what we're going to talk about a little bit through this lecture. And the readings this week, I think, will also help give you some ideas about how to go about doing that well. So I like this quote. It's a little bit long, so let me read it right quick. From Seth Godin. The enemy of creativity is fear. We're all born creative. It takes a little while to become afraid. A surprising insight. An enemy of fear is creativity. Acting in a creative way generates action, and action persuades the fear to lighten up. One of the things I see typically with organizations that are struggling is that leaders in those organizations are often paralyzed. They have a hard time making decisions, and a large part of that is that paralysis, that fear, or that indecision comes from what we've been talking about through the semester. Is just very unpredictable world. Things are changing so fast. It's difficult to make decisions when you don't know the outcome of whether those will be successful. And so, I think a large part of what I want to talk about this week is this concept that Godin talks about in terms of thinking of creativity as the antidote to that fear, thinking of creativity as the way to create forward momentum and action and decision making within an organization. We're all naturally creative when we're kids, and so part of being creative as an adult, I think, is recapturing that mindset that we had when we were kids. So think about what that might be. We learned by playing and having fun. We were curious. We asked questions. We tried things. We experimented. We weren't afraid of being wrong. In some cases, we weren't afraid of getting hurt. All of those things, as you grow up, you kind of lose that ability to be creative and curious and try. So we're going to try to recapture that a little bit, and we'll talk about some ways to do that. I heard from several of you during our one-on-ones last week that you appreciated that I shared some examples along the way of strategic processes in real life, and so I appreciate that feedback, and I will do that again with a couple of examples today. Wanted to start with brainstorming. So brainstorming, I've used this shape of a creative process in previous lectures. Brainstorming really is kind of the fundamental starting point for creative processes. That first phase, the opening, the diverging, the creating ideas that then can be explored and decisions made. So I'm sure all of you have been engaged in brainstorming exercises. You're probably aware that brainstorming typically has some rules that the group follows. Going to talk just about a couple of those. One, typically brainstorming, you want to generate a quantity of ideas. Quantity is more important than the quality of ideas. One of the reasons that this is important is that just the best way to get a single good idea is to have a lot of good ideas. And creating a large quantity of ideas then gives you a lot of fodder to do that exploration phase. One of the articles this week was talking about expertise and knowledge and how that creates a network of possible wanderings. And I think really good brainstorming does the same thing. When you can create a large quantity of ideas to work with, that creates a larger network of possible wanderings, possible solutions that you can come up with. A second rule that I'm sure have heard is that during brainstorming processes, you don't stop to evaluate the ideas, or you don't criticize people's ideas. Typically, you try to build on those ideas. And so this is important for a couple of reasons. One, if you are stopping to evaluate ideas along the way, you're really wasting time in terms of trying to generate that higher quantity. And so it just slows down the process of idea generation. But I think more importantly is that if you are stopping to evaluate, or especially if you're criticizing ideas, that really has a detrimental effect on the creative energy. Certainly is going to prompt some of the people in the group probably to shut down and not be willing to offer up ideas that they might otherwise. And so that's another rule that you typically want to follow. If you do an internet search for brainstorming rules, you'll find these and you'll find some other ones. One rule that you probably won't find is one that I recommend. It's something that I was exposed to a few years ago through a leadership development program, and it's a concept that I call I time. And so the I in I time can stand for a couple of things. One is individual time. I also really prefer to think of it as introvert time. So typically in most brainstorming sessions, it is a verbal exercise, and everybody kind of competes for getting ideas out there and building ideas. And so one of the things I think is really important is to think about how you incorporate introverts within your conversation. I've always really appreciated Susan Cain. She wrote a book just a few years ago called Quiet that really talked about the power of introverts in an organization. And if you think about it, in any given group that you might be meeting with, it's likely that about half of the group are going to be introverts and about half of them will be extroverts. So high time is really about giving everyone in the group kind of equal footing, giving them individual time to think, process ideas, participate without kind of that pressure of having to compete for attention, generate ideas without that concern that you're being critiqued as you are sharing your ideas. And so to make sure you think about how to do that, I thought I would share an example of a process I was part of just earlier this year. I was part of a small team at the university that was brought together to work on some marketing communication goals. And so we had an external consultant, a woman who used to be a vice president of marketing and communications at the University of Michigan, who was working with us. And so one day she was leading our meeting through a video conference, and so she's up on the screen, and she was very excited to lead us through a brainstorming session to generate some ideas about what we could do, unique ideas of ways we could brand the University of Montana. And so she set up the question. We had an easel pad in the room, and we designated somebody to write down the ideas as they came out. And so then she opened it up, and she basically said, "So, all right, who has the first idea?" And there was, as you would guess, a little bit of moment of silence as people thought, and then clearly the most outgoing person in the room was the first to offer up an idea. And so the idea came out. We took 30 seconds or so to write the idea on the easel, and then, okay, what's the next idea? And then there was another pause, and finally another fairly outgoing person in the group offered up an idea. That went up on the easel. So this went on for a while, and the ideas sort of slowed down fairly quickly. And after about 30 minutes of this brainstorming process, our facilitator stopped it. And at that point, there were about 10 of us in the room, and we had generated 10 ideas. And so you can see that we didn't really meet the goal of generating a high quantity of ideas. And I don't think that the quality was particularly stellar either. And so as I was looking at it, and to be honest, 3 or 4 people in the group didn't offer any ideas at all, and I was one of those. And part of it was I was interested in just watching how this process unfolded, but I legitimately was trying to think of ideas. But in this format, I think I felt pressure that my ideas needed to be really different and really special. And I felt like as I was starting to maybe get some focus on my thoughts, somebody else would speak and I'd stop and listen, and we would have this pause. And I never did really have the time to generate, what I thought were meaningful ideas to share. And so think about that in terms of, the value of giving people at the start of every brainstorming session that individual time to write down their own ideas. If you think about it, with 10 people in the room, if we had done that, given each person 5 minutes and given them the goal of generating 10 ideas, I think all 10 people could have probably done that. And then after 5 minutes, we would have had 100 ideas to start with, to start evaluating, making connections between those, seeing where the commonalities were, where the themes were. And so really valuable to be aware of the fact that you do have people who operate differently. Give everyone an even playing field in the creative process. So one more example I want to share. The second reading we had this week is from a chapter from the book Liberating Structures, and it is really about the processes that we can use to generate creative ideas. And so the lecture the reading was about microstructures, and microstructures basically are the elements that a facilitator has at his or her disposal to guide people's behavior, to control people's behavior in these conversations. And so there are 5 of them that are common to all meetings. And so there's the invitation. So basically that is who's involved and what the agenda is, what the purpose of the meeting is. How space is arranged and what materials are used. How participation is distributed among the participants. How groups are configured, and then the sequence of steps and the time allocated to each step. And so I want to share a story of another experience I had where I was the facilitator, and how I tried to take into account all of these different elements of control and kind of the outcomes of that. So early 2016 at the university, a decision was made that we were going to go through a process called program prioritization. And so the idea was that we were going to look at every single one of our academic programs and administrative services and make some decisions about how to evaluate the quality of those services, the viability of those services. And then the idea with this process was that, the programs and services that were really strong would perhaps get additional resources to build on. Those that were in the lower quadrant that maybe were weak would possibly be considered for discontinuation. And so you can imagine with that sort of a backdrop that it was a really political process. It was a really kind of emotional process. People's jobs and careers were on the line. The group that was tasked with doing this, there was a committee formed that was similar in structure to many committees at the university level that included representation from administration, from faculty, from staff, and from students. And so this group worked together for probably about 6 months to kind of define what the data was that they were going to collect that data. Lots of process, kind of like what you've been going through in terms of understanding the current situation and gathering data. And then it came to, I think, June of 2016 when they started having to make some decisions. And so at that point, the chair of the committee asked me if I would be willing to facilitate a retreat for the group. And the purpose of the retreat was sort of twofold. One was they wanted to come out of the retreat with a set of kind of shared decision-making principles that they could use to apply going forward. And the other thing that they, I think, maybe not quite as explicit, but in the background, was that they understood that the group was not really very cohesive, that there was a lot of turf protection and political battles that were going on. And so one of the goals that the chair had was really to come out of this retreat with a little bit more cohesiveness, better relationships, more trust within the group. So that was the backdrop that I was presented with. It was an incredibly daunting challenge to think about that. But one of the things I thought was important was to understand some of the dynamics and how to design a retreat that would overcome some of those. And so in conversations with not just the chair, but with some other members of the group, I learned a couple of things. One was that there was somewhat of some power dynamics that were uneven. And you can imagine how that would happen when you have an administrator and a student in the same room. Who has more power there? Faculty and staff, who has more power there? And so that was one of the things I needed to deal with, was how do I even out the ability for members of this committee who may feel like they didn't have the same level of authority as others, and still get their ideas out on the board, get them to feel like they were engaged in the process. Another somewhat daunting challenge was that I learned that there were at least a couple of members of the committee who, regardless of their position, tended to not know how to shut up. They would basically dominate meetings with kind of long diatribes, taking the group off task and off topic. And so, that was a challenge for me. How do I make sure that these one or two people don't dominate the day? And so in thinking about those challenges, I made the determination that one of the structures that I thought would work really well for most of the day is this structure called 1, 2, 4, all, and it's out of the Liberating Structures book that I've created, or I have a link on Moodle that you can go and look at some of these exercises. And so the 1, 2, 4, all basically is a process, and you can see in this case it says 12 minutes. It's a fairly short process where you can work through a generation of ideas fairly quickly. So the one is really the I time. It is you start with each individual in the group spending a minute or two generating their own ideas. And then you pair up two individuals for a conversation, so sharing those ideas, building on each other's ideas. And then those two people combine with two other people to create four. And then so that group of four then builds on each other's ideas. And the idea is then that they make a decision about what's their one or two best ideas, and then each group gets to share that with everyone. And so I envisioned a set of or a continuum of questions that I would work through this 1, 2, 4, all process, and with the hope that it would do both of the things that I needed to do. One, come up with, in the end, a set of guiding principles for the group, and two, improve relationships and trust within the group. So the other thing I did in preparation is that they have reserved a room in Missoula College. So a couple of days before the retreat, I went over and took a look at the room and scoped out what I was working with. And I was really fortunate. It was a big room that had some modular furniture in it. And so knowing that I was going to use this 1, 2, 4, all concept for a lot of the day, I sent a diagram over to Missoula College and asked them if they could arrange the room to look like this. And just thinking that it would be a great way to have people do the one individual time, and then the 2s and 4s naturally work together in these groupings. So when people came in at the start of the day in the morning, I did not have the seating arrangement for them. I let them sit wherever they wanted to. Some of them immediately pulled out their laptops and plugged them in, and I just would say, we're not going to use computers today. It's fine if you need to check email during the breaks, but don't get too comfortable because we will be moving around. And so I went through this first series of 1, 2, 4 all with people sitting where they had chosen to sit. And then before we went to the next round, I just asked everyone to get up, move to a different table with 3 people they hadn't been sitting with before. And we did that each time so that, as you would imagine at the beginning, the administrators were sitting with administrators, faculty with faculty, staff with staff, students with students. But throughout the day, there was this opportunity to then have one-on-one conversations, small group conversations that were much more diverse. And what I found with the process was that, initially, I think anytime you introduce a format like this that's a little bit out of the ordinary, there's some discomfort, and people are a little bit resistant. After about 2 or 3 times through this process, it was interesting to note that people got it. They saw the pattern. They knew what they were supposed to do. I no longer had to tell people to be quiet during the I time period, and they quickly moved through it. And the process itself sort of disappeared in the backdrop, and really what was important was the conversations and the ideas, and that's what you want with these structures. And later on I got some feedback. I never worked with the group again after that, but they continued on with their process. I did get some feedback from the chair later on that said that the retreat was incredibly helpful in terms of the dynamics changing drastically within the group afterwards. And so, again, I think that's just a good illustration of how important it is to think about how you engage people, and especially how you even the playing field for those who maybe have good ideas but don't have an opportunity to share those in traditional settings. So those are a couple of ideas. There are so many other ways that you can engage in creative processes. Just share, a few things about some of those. I think it's important to challenge assumptions. Adam Grant is, somebody that I recommend you read if you're interested in learning more about creativity. He's got some great books out there, including one that's titled Originals. He talks about, he says, creativity is about being the kind of person who doubts the defaults and looks for better options. So, think about having a brainstorming session where it's all about identifying what some of the existing or prevailing assumptions are within the organization, and then take some time to actually challenge those and think about, what's the opposite of this, or where did this assumption come from? Is it still valid? Those types of things. Reverse thinking. I used this concept a while back when I was working with some of my colleagues in IT, and we had a retreat one day to. One of the focuses of the day was to come up with a set of shared values, and really what that was shared behaviors that we wanted to encourage throughout our organization. And so one of the processes I found basically used this reverse thinking idea. So I had each person in the group individually write down the behaviors that they did not like in the people who worked in the organization. And so they did that, and then I paired them with someone else. They swapped their ideas, and it was the other person would take those ideas, the negatives, and flip the thinking, the reverse of that. And so, as an example of that is, I think somebody said, "I hate it when people are stuck on a project, but they refuse to ask for help." And so it's fairly easy for the other person to say, "Well, I like it when someone's stuck and they're willing to admit they're stuck, and they ask other people for help and they engage other people." And so that kind of thinking then created a lot of really positive behaviors that we wanted to encourage. We spent a little bit more time thinking through, prioritizing, putting those into some larger kind of themes. and then that became sort of the foundation for the culture that we wanted to promote in our organization. Linking unrelated concepts, that's really where new ideas come from. There's maybe not new ideas, but there's just new ways of combining. So think about how you can do that. If you generate a lot of ideas in that evaluation period and in that exploration period, find ways to get your group to put together two ideas that maybe seemingly don't go together, and then explore maybe how they would go together. Visual thinking is, I think, a really important tool. Think about ways to engage drawing as part of your creative thinking and solutions. That does a couple of things. One is visual thinking and drawing engages the right side of our brain, which is typically the more intuitive side. It's the side of the brain that is able to see patterns. And so you don't have to be an artist. You can draw stick figures, but drawing is a really helpful way to not just communicate, but to think through solutions. And storytelling is a similar valuable tool. We humans have used storytelling for millennia as a tool for passing down wisdom. Storytelling is the way that we share experiences with each other. It's the way that we share emotion with each other. And so there's some really nice techniques for incorporating storytelling into creative processes. So look at the resources that I have online and look for some of those things. One of them in the game storming is called Fireside, I think, something like that, or Campfire. Campfire. So it's basically the concept that you're sitting around a campfire telling stories, and it's just a nice way to build on each other's stories and build kind of a shared framework. And then the last one that's on this list, problem framing. Right now you're at the stage in your projects where you are starting to frame the problems that the organization is facing. And so often we don't go deep enough in doing that. And we the critical thing is if you frame a problem too narrowly or you frame it incorrectly, then your strategies are naturally not going to meet the real needs. And so spend time, again, brainstorming, what the problems are, and then really questioning those assumptions. Go through a series of questions about, is this really the problem, or is there another way to look at this problem? So just some ideas, lots of things for you to think about. Like I said, there's some resources on Moodle for you to look at if you're looking for some processes you might be able to use in your next phase of your projects. And if you have questions and want to talk about any of those, please let me know. We do have discussion one more again this week. So Troy, Lisa, Sarah are going to be our discussion leaders. I've really enjoyed, and I think the discussions have been very rich. So I appreciate your participation in that. And that's it for the week. So good luck, everyone, and we'll talk to you next week.